administration. And she did so in the face of a pledge that she made when campaigning for mayor that she would not do any international travel and would go only to a fairly small number of places that were obvious, like San Francisco, San Diego, Washington, D.C., and so on. So she, as a result, was subject to criticism for her absenteeism in the face of the natural disaster. And not only that, when she got back, which she did probably about as soon as she could from Ghana, when she got back, she didn't display any great passion or empathy with the victims of the fire. Was simply straightforward in her comments, and so lost an opportunity to make up for the fact that she had been absent at the beginning. Then the state came in for criticism for allocating too much water to Northern California at the expense of Southern California, even though far more people lived in Southern California and there was greater likelihood in Southern California. This criticism was focused on Governor Newsom, who during his tenure in office had presided over one disaster after another and was taken by Republicans as evidence that Newsom was not competent as governor. Then there were serious coordination problems. There are 88 municipal jurisdictions in Los Angeles County, almost each of which has its own fire department. And Los Angeles County has a fire department. And it was understandably difficult to get all of these units coordinated and able to respond in a systematic way to the fires, and that limited the ability to respond. There's a contrast with San Francisco, where the county and the city are coterminous, so there's only one jurisdiction that's relevant. And then last Friday, President Trump visited California. It's a common function of the president to visit sites of disasters and usually to pledge federal disaster relief funds from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, or other bodies. Trump, in his visit on Friday, seemingly placed conditions on federal disaster aid to California. He said, for example, he wanted California to adopt a voter ID law, which would require an act of the California legislature and has, on the face of it, nothing to do with disaster aid or relief. In contrast, he also visited North Carolina, where there was continuing damage from Hurricane Helene in the fall, and placed no conditions on disaster aid to North Carolina. Now, both North Carolina and California had Democratic governors, but North Carolina voted for Trump, the presidential election, and is known as a red state. So we have an example here at least on the surface, of what Trump has called weaponizing the administrative agencies of the federal government. It illustrates the politicization of what is normally a completely apolitical and non-political activity of government. So that's the first major event of the new year. Now I want to come forward to the 15th of the month, when President Biden delivered his farewell address. I have a special interest in this since, as most of you know, my field of study is rhetoric. And so I was especially interested to hear how President Biden was going to structure his farewell address. We should be clear, there is no constitutional requirement for the president to give a farewell address. And not all presidents do so, although most have done so. The most famous, some of you may remember, we sat in this room together 8 years ago listening to President Obama's farewell address, which was scheduled on the same night as we had a meeting of this class. The most famous of the farewell addresses is the very first, George Washington's, in 1796, which, by the way, was not delivered as a speech, but was published as an article, a letter really, in the Philadelphia newspaper. And it was in that letter that Washington announced that he would not run for a third term. He had run for a second one somewhat reluctantly, and he said that was enough. And he thereby began the tradition that lasted all the way until Franklin Roosevelt of a president not serving more than 2 terms. The only other one that I can think of that tried for a third term was Ulysses Grant, and he tried for a non-consecutive third term. Anyway, so Washington declined to run, and he warned in the speech against 2 dangers. One of them was political parties. And the problem with political parties, Washington alleged, was that they would pursue a narrow self-interest instead of the virtuous public interest of the country as a whole. And he also warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations. He did not say entangling alliances. That was a phrase that Jefferson used. But he did warn against forming permanent alliances because he said they don't leave the country free to act in its own interest, but they tie it to the interests of other nations. The most famous contemporary farewell address, and I use the word contemporary loosely because whether it's contemporary or not will depend on your age, but it's President Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, in which he warned against the military-industrial complex with its potential for misplaced and unchecked power. Well, if we look across the whole series of farewell addresses, we can see that they have 2 common characteristics, 2 generic elements, if you will. One, they celebrate the country's achievements under the departing administration. Without exception, so far as I can think, they declare that the country is better off at the end of the president's term than it was at the beginning. And they usually credit that not to the president personally, but to the people collectively. And then 2, they adopt the pose of an elder statesman to warn against impending risks that they hope the country will be able to avoid. Now, how does Biden's farewell address compare against these generic features? Well, it's interesting. Biden explicitly abbreviated the celebration of what had been accomplished, not because he thought there weren't significant accomplishments, but because he said everybody knows that, which may have been a serious mistake on his part. Everybody knows that, and he wanted to have more time to warn against the danger that he thought was most compelling. And that danger was oligarchy. That is, the control of power by a small number of very wealthy individuals. And it's a reasonable guess that he had the incoming administration in mind, although he spoke more broadly than that. He spoke about the importance of building the country from the middle out, the significance of the middle class, and the importance of exalting that sense of the country rather than one that was dominated by oligarchs. Biden's farewell address attracted relatively little attention. I happened to see it in its entirety, and I suspect maybe 1 or 2 of you did. It was delivered to an audience of his supporters at the White House from the Oval Office, but it was broadcast nationally. The main reason I think it had little impact is because of another event that occurred earlier in the day on January 15th. That's the third topic that I want to talk about. And that is the announcement after many, many months of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And the ceasefire generally followed the lines of the proposal that President Biden had first put forward back in May of 2024. It envisioned three phases: an initial phase of 6 weeks, during which there would be a partial pullback by Israel and Hamas. Gazans would begin a return to what was left of their homes. There would be a staged release of 33 hostages and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, starting on day 16 of the ceasefire, which is a week from tomorrow, I believe, or today. Starting on day 16 of the ceasefire, the parties would negotiate terms for the second phase, which would include complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and steps to bring an end to the war and to begin the process of forming a Palestinian state. The negotiations were directed by the Biden administration in the person of his Middle East envoy, Brett McGurk. But the Biden administration invited, participate fully in the discussions, the incoming Trump administration's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. Now, Trump had said that if there was no ceasefire by the time of his inauguration, there would be hell to pay in the Middle East. As a result of which, Trump claimed the credit for the success of the ceasefire, claiming that it resulted from his threat. That's questionable, but there is enough credit to go around. Witkoff's involvement was critical to getting the final resolution. Now, if the negotiations in phase one break down, either side can return to war at the end of phase one. In other words, there's no assurance that the ceasefire will outlast the 42 days. And there's some on both sides who want this to happen. On the Israeli side, the party of Itamar Ben-Gvir, which has left the government over the ceasefire, has said it will come back into the government only if the war is resumed until Hamas is eliminated at the end of the 6 weeks. The other extreme right-wing party, led by Bezalel Smotrich, has not yet done the same, but threatens to do so. So resumption of the war is in the interest of the far-right parties, and it's in the interest, in that sense, of the Netanyahu government, because his remaining in power may depend upon it. On the other side, Hamas's continued existence may depend upon it. On the other hand, the interest of the United States depends upon the ceasefire holding. The overriding American interest is in bringing about a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would recalibrate the balance of power in the Middle East. So it's a fragile ceasefire. Whether it continues beyond the initial period is highly uncertain, and it will depend upon events that have yet to take place. Early celebrations over the ceasefire may at best seem premature, but the chances have not been better at any point before this. So let me move now to the fourth topic, and the last one I'm going to take up before we get to the new president and what he's been up to. And that is Biden's last-minute moves. He made two major activities in the closing moments of his presidency. One of them, not too many of us have heard about. He proclaimed that the 28th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified. Now, you all know what the 28th Amendment to the Constitution is. It's the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first proposed in 1923 and was sent out from Congress as a constitutional amendment in 1972. In that amendment, it said that it would be inoperative unless ratified by 3/4 of the states within 7 years. They missed that deadline. As the 7-year deadline approached, they passed an extension for 3 years. They missed that deadline. Meanwhile, 3 states that had ratified the amendment attempted to rescind their ratifications. New ratifications continued after the deadline had been passed, and 3 more states ratified it. So if you're following my arithmetic, 38 states have at some point ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. 38 states equals 3/4 of the states in the Union, which is the number that is necessary to ratify a constitutional amendment. There was great pressure on Biden to declare the amendment ratified. The way that happens is the president says that the necessary number of states have ratified the amendment, and the president directs the archivist of the United States to certify that the amendment is now part of the Constitution. But wait, do ratifications after the time limit count? Do rescinded ratifications count? Both of these are in dispute. There is some precedent on the matter of rescinded ratifications. The 19th Amendment, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, a couple of states attempted to rescind that, and the relevant decision of the courts was that the rescission is not legal. Rescission doesn't count. There's no case testing the time limit. Only some of the most recent amendments have had a time limit in it. For example, the 27th Amendment. You all know what that is, right? The 27th Amendment is the one that says Congress can't increase its own salary, but there has to be an intervening election. That was first proposed in 1791. It was going to be one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, and it was finally ratified in 1992. There was no time limit in it. There has been serious argument that the time limits are not legal, and hence the fact that 38 states didn't ratify by the deadline doesn't mean anything. So what did Biden do? He proclaimed the amendment as in effect, but he did not direct the archivist to publish it, which means his action is not complete. It's somewhat symbolic rather than fully legal, but it does create a situation in which it's now very hard for somebody to argue that women do not have equal rights. Although you could say it was hard to argue that even before Biden's proclamation, because one of the arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment had always been that women's equal rights were guaranteed by other legislative actions, so the Equal Rights Amendment was superfluous. In short, we end up about where we started out on this amendment, except that President Biden certainly indicated where his own sympathies lay. The other action that he took on the way out the door was much more widely known, and that is he made generous use of the power of the president grant clemency through pardons and commutations of sentences. You could say in a way that he began doing this when he pardoned his son, Hunter Biden, after insisting that he would not do so, claiming that Hunter Biden had been the victim of selective prosecution. But in his last days in office, he extended the clemency power, first of all, to most criminals who had been given the death penalty and were awaiting their execution. Now, unlike what President Trump said, Biden did not pardon these people. He commuted their sentences to life in prison without parole. So they didn't get out. They didn't get out, but what Biden did was to give voice to his own personal opposition to capital punishment. He made a few exceptions, by the way, that he did not commute, and one of those was the shooter in the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh from 2018, I believe it was. But then, on his last morning in office, he extended pardons to several members of his family, to the members of the January 6th investigating committee in the House, to a number of other individuals, General Mark Milley of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dr. Anthony Fauci, I don't think there were others. There may have been others that I'm forgetting. These pardons were heavily criticized. And they were criticized, first of all, because they were preemptive in nature. Now, there is some experience with preemptive pardons. When Ford pardoned Nixon, for example, Nixon had not been formally accused of anything. He hadn't been indicted. He hadn't been tried or convicted. And Ford pardoned him for any offenses that he might have committed. Well, this group of pardons was like that. It's not that any of the individuals had been charged or prosecuted or convicted, but they were subject to investigation by the incoming Trump administration. And Trump had claimed that he was going to put FBI agents and others on these individuals and see what he could dig up. And why was he doing this? In retaliation for what he said was done unto him, when, as he saw it, he had done nothing wrong, yet was the victim of one investigation after another, which he falsely claimed had been orchestrated by the Biden administration, even though there were in two cases by a special prosecutor to retain independence, and in two cases by state level authorities. Excuse me, just. Acceptance of a pardon in traditional understanding of the law, acceptance of a pardon implies acknowledgement of guilt. But with the preemptive use of the pardon, there's no acknowledgement of guilt, there's no accusation of guilt. Guilt is irrelevant. It really is a protection against any possible future investigation, and that's how they were received. It's not clear, for that matter, that one can decline a pardon. Two of the people who were given pardons, Senator Adam Schiff and former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, both members of the, Kinzinger, a member of the January 6th committee, and Schiff, the prosecutor in Trump's first impeachment trial, said they had done nothing wrong and did not want pardons. But the pardons were not given to them individually, but they were given collectively to the entire group of people that were involved in those efforts. So it's not clear that they can decline the pardon. So for both of those reasons, the preemptive pardons came into serious criticism. Now, I have to say, I can understand what led Biden to make that decision. I think he was right when he said that even when there's no sense of guilt at all, the mere fact of an investigation can destroy a person's character and a person's personal finances. And he wanted to avoid that. Trump, at the end of his first term, had publicly considered giving preemptive pardons to a number of people, and Biden said it would set a terrible precedent. He hoped he wouldn't do it, and Trump ended up not doing it. So it's Biden who then sets the precedent that he warns about. Well, now Mr. Biden is on the plane on his way to a vacation well earned in California, and Mr. Trump, now the president. He had already delivered his inaugural address, and he had already been sworn in before that recessional that went out to the helicopter. By the way, it used to be done in the other order. In the 19th century, presidents gave their inaugural address before they took the oath of office. And they made reference to what was going to happen when they took the oath. I'm sure that any of you who suffered from insomnia last Thursday night took advantage of the opportunity to catch me on a podcast that was aired at 4 a.m. Friday morning under the title History Behind the News, during which the interviewer and I discussed the history of inaugural addresses and how Trump's fit in. So I'll give you only a brief summary of what I said then. First off, just like with a farewell address, there's no constitutional requirement for an inaugural address. In fact, the only address there is a requirement for is the State of the Union. But every president has given an inaugural address, and they've tended to fall into a fairly familiar pattern. If you omit the first three, two by George Washington and the one by John Adams. Washington's first inaugural talked about the need for virtue in public office. And by virtue, he meant a preference for the public good over the private good. His second inaugural is the shortest on record. It's only 135 words long. And it says basically, here I'm taking the inaugural in the presence of Congress. And if I violate the oath, here I'm taking the oath. And if I violate the oath, you will be justified not only in giving me the constitutional punishment of impeachment, but of censuring me publicly. That's about all he said. And John Adams gave a speech in which he essentially gave an homage to the founders generally and Washington specifically. What begins the trend that carries out in the modern inaugural was Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural, given in 1801. You may remember this from your history. The election of 1800 was one of the most bitterly contested, one of the most negative, one of the most hostile that we have experienced. And it was close. The election went into the House of Representatives because of a quirk in the Constitution. And it took 36 ballots in the House of Representatives for Jefferson to be elected president. And it only happened on the 36th ballot because a deal was made that one or two of the states that had an equal number of representatives of both parties would abstain. So Jefferson was elected as president of the United States on February 15th or 16th of 1801, and inauguration day was March 4th. So he had about 2 weeks to get ready. He needed to somehow get past the bitterness of the election, and he used his inaugural in order to do that. The features of Jefferson's first inaugural have been carried out in most of the subsequent inaugurals, even if the elections haven't been so bitter. They've been described as closer than they were, or as raising as a fundamental principle, or in some other way being so significant that we had to get past them in the inaugural address. So here are the 5 key features that you find in almost all of the inaugural addresses, adapted, of course, to circumstances. 1, reconstitution of the American people as united rather than divided. 2, moving on beyond the bitterness of the election. 3, outlining the general principles of the incoming administration, but not specifics, not legislative proposals. Those were held for the State of the Union and later messages. 4, acknowledging the incoming president's personal limitations and praising the people as a way to compensate for the limitations of the president. And 5, asking God's help and God's blessing, and often quoting from specific pieces of scripture, sometimes making general references to providence or divine help or something like that. Trump's first inaugural address sort of follows some of those principles while twisting them in different ways from the way they were usually seen. Trump's second inaugural address violates almost all of these generic expectations. It lists highly specific actions to be taken and often executive orders to be issued. Some commentators said, well, this is like a State of the Union address, but not really. The State of the Union address typically packages legislative proposals in broad themes. It's more like a campaign speech. And indeed, it's very similar to the speeches he gave at rallies throughout the presidential campaign. Instead of getting past the election, it refers back to the election. It talks about which states voted for whom, how Trump carried all of the swing states, how he had a landslide victory in the Electoral College, which was not a landslide at all, and so on. It replays the election instead of moving past it. There are some general references like a golden age, greater strength, manifest destiny, the parallel that he drew to President William McKinley, and so on, but they're downplayed in speech. He praises the people not for compensating for his limitations, but for voting for him. And he speaks as if he won the popular vote unanimously. He describes the whole country as coming together behind him. And instead of seeking God's blessing, he proclaims himself as God's chosen. He said, God saved me for a reason on that July afternoon in Pennsylvania. And what was the reason? To make America great again. The speech is partisan. It insults his opponents who are sitting just a few feet away from him. And that was accentuated by the fact that the speech was delivered indoors in a much smaller place than was planned for its delivery because of the weather. So because of that, a lot of people couldn't get into the Capitol Rotunda. So there was an overflow room set up for dignitaries, mostly Republican governors and senators, in Emancipation Hall, which is downstairs in the Capitol Visitor Center. And there he gave a bonus, I was about to say bogus, a bonus inaugural speech, ad lib, in which he said he was going to talk about the things that Melania and J.D. Vance insisted that he take out of the formal speech. we can decide whether we believe that or not. But he reprised familiar themes. The 2020 election was stolen, rigged, and he was the presidency was stolen from him. He promised pardons for the J6 hostages, as he referred to them, which he implemented that very night. He said there would be an end to the weaponization of the DOJ, the Department of Justice, which he's carrying out as we speak by firing attorneys and staff and inspectors general and so on. This was a longer speech than the formal inaugural, and Trump proclaimed it to be a better speech than the formal inaugural and said, "Don't you agree?" And of course, his partisan audience cheered. Both these speeches, the formal one and the informal one, are thematically similar to his first inaugural address from 2017, although without the wording of American carnage. In all three cases, the scenario is a dark present plus himself as the deus ex machina, leading to a bright future. And of course, the problem he's got in 2025 is when he contrasts his promise with the dark present, darkness sweeps over several past administrations, but of course ignores his own. And he accomplishes that by simply saying nothing about his first administration. Well, now Trump begins to work. And one form of that work is issuing a flood of executive orders. It's claimed to be about 200 executive orders. I don't know if that's an accurate count or not, but that's highly unusual to do anything like that. And it was an attempt to dramatize Trump getting right to work. He wanted to do something that carried out executive powers. Now, what many of those executive orders were doing is directing the executive branch agencies to do something or other. You don't need an executive order for that purpose. You just tell them what you want them to do and instruct them to do it. Executive orders cannot outweigh laws or court decisions, although the executive order concerning TikTok arguably does both, since there had been a law duly passed by Congress, upheld by the Supreme Court, and already one day into effect before Trump issued the executive order directing the agencies not to enforce it for 75 days, during which he'll try to work out a deal. That's of questionable legality. To say the least, it is pushing the bounds of executive power, and that's what Trump uses the executive orders to do. It dramatizes pushing against and maybe beyond the limits of executive power. Well, there's no way I can go through all or even most of these executive orders. I just want to talk about some of the key themes that they're grouped into. The first of which, and the most obvious, is immigration and deportation. Now, these executive orders reflect an underlying premise that I think Trump expresses in one of them, and that is the belief that the United States is being invaded by illegal aliens crossing over the border from Mexico. And most people who've criticized these executive orders deny that premise. They claim that it's factually wrong, that there's no invasion, that the number of illegal aliens entering the country has declined, that immigrants commit fewer crimes than native-born Americans, and so on. But the executive orders led first to a declaration of national emergency at the southern border, authorizing the military to assist in deportations. It then broadens its effect beyond illegals to refuse entry to those who had been authorized to come in under two programs of the Biden administration that were temporary but legal. One was people who could make appointments from the U.S. rather than remaining in Mexico, and the other was refugees from Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Then there was an executive order revoking birthright citizenship, which Trump claimed was being used by people to enter the country for the purpose of procreating people who would be citizens. And this is another one that on its face is patently unconstitutional. As a district judge in Washington state said, it violates the terms of the 14th Amendment, which states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. Well, the Trump lawyers are trying to do something with the construction of subject to the jurisdiction thereof, claim that children of illegal immigrants are somehow not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. In the court case that resulted in a temporary blockage of this executive order, in the court case, the Trump attorney was asked if such a person violates the law, are they not subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. for punishment? And the answer was they're subject to the jurisdiction for the law, but not for citizenship. And that was never explained, and the judge did not take seriously that that was a sound argument. Then there were orders related to gender rights, the underlying premise of which was the protection of women from what the order called gender ideology. And again, those who challenged this group of executive orders generally denied that underlying premise that women were in need of such protection or that the orders would grant it to them. But it says that the federal government recognizes only two genders, both of which are immutable. It's flying in the face of a good deal of scientific evidence and research, and reverses several specific Biden administration policies that had extended transgender rights. This most directly affects passport applications, federal documents which no longer will provide the option to describe your gender as other or non-binary or other terms that had been used. It may affect government funding for programs of various kinds. It affects workers' rights. It requires the maintenance of certain single-sex facilities such as prisons for the protection of women. So we've got immigration orders, we've got gender orders, then there are orders related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, famous DEI trilogy. The underlying premise of these is that society should be colorblind and merit-based, and that to do otherwise is both radical and wasteful. It does not engage the line of argument that says the way to achieve a merit-based society is to correct errors with respect to inclusion, diversity, and equity. It closes all the DEI offices in the federal government and lays off all the employees of such offices, put them on administrative leave for 30 days, and then discharges them. It encourages snitching, that's my term, technical term, on the part of federal employees who witness attempts to get around or to circumvent this executive order by renaming DEI programs as something else. It gives them 10 days to inform, and threatens them with unstated adverse consequences if they don't. And for good measure, it revokes an executive order promulgated in 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson that barred discrimination in the federal workforce or in federal hiring because it is based on the assumption that that executive order is the foundation for affirmative action, which it is, and that affirmative action is the foundation for preferential treatment and for this DEI radical wokeness. Then there are executive orders regarding federal employees, the underlying premise of which is that the federal government is both overstaffed and full of what Trump would regard as deep state employees who are there to thwart his programs that have the support of the American people. He asserts the authority to fire a broader category of senior civil servants and limits the appeal rights of those set for termination. And this is what I was hearing on the radio as I was coming over here this evening, that this is going on right now. And then finally, not because there are no more executive orders, but because I can only go so far, there are orders withdrawing from certain international organizations. The Paris Agreement on Climate, again, he withdrew from it in his first term. Biden reversed that. He's withdrawing again. And the World Health Organization, which he was claiming to withdraw from because we paid so much more than China, he may be willing to reverse that. He's talking today after hearing what the World Health Organization does and how global health and health in the United States is at risk if we withdraw. Well, as you can imagine, all of these executive orders have been subject to criticism. And the response by Trump and his supporters to the criticism is, look, these are the issues on which I ran. The people voted for me. Therefore, I'm doing what the people want and carrying out my promises, and quit whining. Now, this is partly true. Trump did campaign on these issues. The question is, does voting for a candidate imply accepting the candidate's platform? Well, sometimes yes, when the issue is such a central theme of the campaign that you can't separate it from the candidate, such as stepping up the deportation of illegal immigrants, or to go back 60 years, acceptance of Medicare after the 1964 election landslide. But even then, support for the issue does not necessarily mean support for all the specific policy proposals. And sometimes you can't even assume a mandate for any policy proposal. People vote for a candidate for all different sorts of reasons. And you usually find polls showing supporters of a candidate who support particular policy positions and supporters of that same candidate who oppose policy positions. Well, what's Trump been doing besides executive orders? I have a couple of other things to talk about, and then I'll be quiet and we'll open up the discussion. Another thing Trump has done in the past week is broad exercise of the powers of clemency, especially pardons. Now, in the area of pardons, presidential power is almost absolute. That's what attracted Trump to the use of pardons in his first administration, because he has almost unchecked power with respect to pardons. Trump had campaigned on a pledge to pardon the J6 hostages without specifying whether he meant all of them or whether he excluded some of them, such as those convicted of attacks against the police or violent crimes. And also without specifying whether he meant a blanket action or a case-by-case action. Vice President Vance said, of course, it'll be case by case. Several of Trump's cabinet nominees said, of course, he will develop a procedure for reviewing these cases individually. He did no such thing. On his first evening in office Monday night, he issued a pardon to almost 1,600 people who had been convicted of various activities in the riots of January 6th, and in 14 cases, he commuted sentences to time served, thereby releasing those people as well. The contention by Trump's allies that what legitimized Trump doing this was Biden's last-minute pardons doesn't appear to me to hold water. On the face of it, there's no connection between the two. The Biden pardons went to people who hadn't even been accused of crime and were preemptive. The Trump pardons went to people who had been convicted of some very serious crime. Trump's notion, of course, is that the J6 hostages, as he refers to them, are patriots who simply took it upon themselves to exercise their First Amendment rights at the Capitol. Another thing Trump has done is threatened to levy tariffs. Now, the presidential power over tariffs is great if they're imposed in the name of national security. Well, you can always claim they're imposed in the name of national security. Trump had begun to impose tariffs during his first term, especially against China. Biden kept many of these. But Trump imposed 25% tariffs against Mexico and Canada, effective February 1st, ostensibly because they were not cooperating with us to thwart illegal immigration and the sending of fentanyl into the United States. He threatened a 60% tariff against China. He threatened a 10% universal tariff. And yesterday and this morning, he was involved in a brief tariff war with Colombia, which refused to receive military airplanes carrying deportees. Trump responded with massive tariffs, 25% immediately, 50% next week. The president of Colombia modified his position and said he would send Colombian airplanes to the United States to pick up these deportees, which was claimed by Trump as an added advantage because it would save the U.S. money. And I believe that the tariffs were then rescinded, and the situation with Colombia was a deal that resolved itself quite publicly between yesterday and this morning. And then the last topic I want to discuss, those of you that are nodding off, this is the last one, and that is appointments. Appointments of cabinet secretaries, those who meet with the cabinet, and with a number of other offices. Trump announced his proposed cabinet appointments very shortly after the election. Some of them had widespread support, most notably Senator Marco Rubio, who was confirmed unanimously by the Senate. Some had very little support, such as Matt Gaetz, who was originally picked to be Attorney General and then withdrew when Trump advised him that he didn't have the votes to get confirmed. And Pete Hegseth, who was confirmed the other day on a 50-50 vote, with 3 Republicans defecting, including Mitch McConnell, the former majority leader, and Vice President J.D. Vance breaking the tie to confirm Hegseth. The underlying issue with some of these candidates is what counts as qualified. Reason for arguing against them is that they're unqualified, by which is usually meant they lack experience in a similar position, they lack executive experience or managerial experience, etc. But the Trump answer and the Trump supporter answer to what counts as qualified is these are people who are prepared to disrupt things. Voters voted for disruption, for major change. And so these are people who will get into these departments and they will bust them up. And that's what we need to do, and that's what counts as qualified. There's a difference between the first term and the second term appointments. In the second term, Trump has been more willing to nominate and support outsiders, not people with formal or previous experience. But I predict that in the second term, like the first term, there will be a revolving door to character to these appointments. They will disappoint Trump over something or other, and Trump will respond by firing them as he did during the first term. And that's where I'll end up. I went longer than usual tonight, but I warned you there was more to talk about. So Pierce, can you come out? Okay. Pierce is going to coordinate comments, questions from those of you listening remotely, and I'll catch people here. We have about 25 minutes of time for discussion or question. Okay, Jackie.
Hi, it's very interesting. Thank you so much. I have two questions. One, I heard that because of the California fires, the president wanted to disband FEMA. Isn't that a government agency, and does he have the power to disband FEMA?
Question one, yes, it's a government agency, and it's part of the executive branch. I believe it would require an act of Congress to disband it.
And my second question has to do with undocumented immigrants. How does ICE or the people find these? How are they listed? How are they known? How do they find their information, their addresses to know to find these people? I was just curious about that. Is there some kind of a list or something? When people move too frequently too.
I don't know the answer to that question, frankly, but I suspect there's no published address list that they consult. They go around to workplaces that are known to be friendly to undocumented immigrants and ask to see people's papers, usually without warning. They've been given the authority in one of Trump's executive orders to do the same in hospitals, churches, and schools, which previously were off limits. But I can't tell you exactly.
Thank you very much.
Faye.
Maybe you did and I missed it. Trump's decision to get rid of several IGs from several departments. Do you think that's likely going to stick, or will he get some significant pushback about that?
I mentioned it briefly.
Okay.
He has fired 12 inspectors general. Now we know what inspectors general do. So you know the purpose of his firing them. It's flatly illegal. There's a law which requires if he wants to fire an inspector general, he has to give Congress 30 days notice and explain in some detail the reasons for the firing. He has so far ignored that legal requirement. It will undoubtedly be challenged. How the legal challenge will result, I obviously have no idea. Pierce.
I had kind of a question. So I'm in Gen Z, I guess, and right now the perception. I don't know where the heck. Nah.
The Inspector General is an official within the agency that's responsible for investigating corruption and lawlessness within the agency. No. Yeah. No, they investigate the activities of the agency itself. I mean, you could say they're kind of like ombudsmen. Okay, Pierce, you want to try again? You're in
Yeah,
Gen Z.
sorry. So yeah, I was just saying right now the Democratic Party did not do as well as they thought that they would. Do you think that they're going to pivot some of their messaging in the future, or they're going to continue to try to be in the middle as they are, or they tried for this election?
That's a very good question about the future of the Democratic Party. I think you're absolutely right. They did not do anywhere near as well as they thought they would. And I think part of the reason we talked about the last time we met right after the election is the issues that they had going for them, abortion rights and democracy especially, did not end up carrying anywhere near as much weight with most of the audience as did immigration and inflation, which were the two major issues that the Republicans had going for them. I think the Democratic Party, well, you could always say it's divided. Remember, Will Rogers said, "I'm not a member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." But there's a tension going on within the party between its centrist wing and its progressive wing, and this is no secret. And neither one of the wings is large enough by itself to carry the day. So I think what the Democratic Party has got to do is to figure out some transcendent issues and focus on them. And that would involve some degree of retreat from the personal identity issues that characterized much but not all of their argument in this campaign. I mean, that's my take anyway. Now, this problem is compounded by the fact that you mentioned when you said you're part of Gen Z. I mean, this is an age-related distinction between older and younger members of the Democratic Party, which doesn't make it any easier. Other comments, questions? Who's got the question? Okay, Mort first and then Bob. You're muted, Mort.
David, thank you for summarizing what you did. On the one hand, what Trump has done is quite impressive. The organization that they put together to be able to issue all of these executive orders is amazing. I mean, you normally talk about the first 100 days. You haven't even gotten through the first week barely, and all this is out there. I don't see how.
Barely the first 100 hours.
And secondly, the total lack of backbone by the Republican senators as it relates to any of these issues and the appointment process leads me to believe that Trump will soon be a dictator. And there doesn't seem to be anybody around him to rein him in. And but for perhaps the courts, we are in big trouble.
And of course, the big unknown about the courts is what the Supreme Court with his 3 appointees will do.
Right. But, he has undone so much of what has been accomplished in the last, 50 years as it relates to civil rights and a lot of what that, you know, our country has done that I just don't see who's going to stop him here. So it's very concerning, very concerning.
I share your concern. I mean, the only kind of consolation is that history suggests that people with lots of power overreach.
Yeah. Well, the other problem with that is he's backed by billionaires who have an unlimited amount of money to help him elect the senators and representatives come 26. It's scary. It's very scary.
I agree with you.
Other than that, everything's going fine.
Bob, I'm sorry.
That kind of leads me to my question. What do you think of his connection with big business, basically, let's say, I'll try to be kind, kissing up to him, the Bezos, the Zuckerbergs, the Ellisons, of course, the first pal, Mr. Musk, the guy from Microsoft, Nadella, etc. I mean, it's almost like you know, they're running to him. It is a interesting situation that you know, they're trying to get as much as possible out of him. But I guess that happens sometimes in bubbles, and bubbles can last a while. So, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's an open question, who's kissing up to whom in that relationship. I think there's good reason that Biden warned against oligarchy in his farewell address. I don't know what else to say.
It's interesting. Never dull.
Thank you, David. I'm Bruce Enty. There's been a lot of talk about how do we survive the next 4 years. And I'm wondering if it's actually more a question of how do we survive the next 2 years, given the, in my view, likelihood that there will be as is traditional, a resurgence of the party not in power during the midterm elections, which follows also from my expectation that it'll take 2 years for many of the MAGA devotees to realize that Trump is not doing anything in their interests. And they will become, at least a certain proportion of them will become disillusioned by the time of the midterms, leading to either staying at home or voting for Democratic candidates in the midterm elections, and that the control of the Senate and perhaps even of the House of Representatives, despite Republican gerrymandering, may become a brake on some of the excesses of Trump's first 2 years, when I think, as Mort properly said, the obsequiousness of Republican senators, shameful as it is, serves only to aggrandize the imperial presidency.
Well, I mean, you're correct in drawing on those historical trends. They may play themselves out. On the other hand, the Senate seats up in 2026 are not significantly more favorable to the Democrats than they were in 2024. The House has fewer and fewer competitive races because of redistricting, with the result that the real race is in the primary rather than in the general election. And in the primary, you can see the financial resources that are at Trump's control that Mort was referring to deployed in behalf of candidates who may be, as a result, more likely to lose in the general election, but maybe not. So I mean, I'd say you cite grounds for hope, and they're not without foundation, but they won't happen of their own accord. And they take some really careful and smart strategizing on the part of the Democratic Party.
I'm not even sure I'd go so far as to say signs of hope as opposed to signs of lesser despair.
Okay,
It comes down to the will of the people. I just came from an indivisible event. It was for this, and the room was packed. Went to another event 2 nights ago, and the room was packed. Now, we can give up, but I refuse. I like democracy. And we have to remember we lost by 300,000 votes, that 50% of 50% voted for Trump.
not quite 50.
Or yeah, you have to help me. So,
Yeah,
and plus the independents. Okay, so we have to remember that.
right.
We have to remember that, and I heard Hungary or Erdogan had 60%. If we give up, then we lose. And we have to have the will to fight. We just have to. So, yeah, Trump is a bully, and he's going to bully us. Or are we going to let him? I'm going to go down fighting, at least trying. I don't know yet how. I don't understand it all. But democracy is really great. That guy is just, I can't even find the right words. He's the ugliest American in the world, and I just don't want to see him win. So I don't know how to adjust. You know, it comes down to our will, how much Americans are willing to fight. And if we didn't, we have to fight. But so many people don't seem to care enough, and that's what concerns me.
Well, Jody, thank you for that. And again, welcome. Good to have you with us in this class, and good to have you with us at Beth Emmet. We do have to remember a couple of things. One is we live in a bubble. This is not a microcosm of the country. And any attempt to generalize from being at an event on the North Shore somewhere that's packed to where the country is as a whole is likely to be fallacious. On the other hand, your basic point is correct. And one of the things I think it's very important that we not do is start out our thinking and our planning from the assumption that Trump won in a landslide, which is what he wants us to believe. The popular vote, as Bruce says, he won less than a majority. The states that he won, he usually won by just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4%. The Electoral College vote, which he's portrayed as a landslide, I haven't checked this out, but I think it's one of the 10 or 12 closest electoral vote elections. Okay, it's somewhere in there. Good for you. Good for you. We need that. We need that. Okay. Other comments?
I have a question. This is Trump's second term, but it's not consecutive. Can he run again?
No. The wording of the 22nd Amendment is very clear. It says a president can serve a maximum of 2 terms unless he served less than 2 years of another person's term, in which case he could have 2 plus. Someone, I forget who, a representative in Congress, has introduced a proposal for a constitutional amendment to change that, to provide that a person can serve a 3rd term if he served 2 non-consecutive terms. I can tell you that's absolutely impossible to get anywhere. You can just do the math and try to figure out how 38 states would ratify such an amendment as that. So no, he cannot serve beyond this term.
Thank you. That's very good news. That really made my day today.
Bruce?
I've been sort of a proponent of letting Trump have free rein for the time being. And I'm sorry that Matt Gaetz is not going to be the Attorney General of the United States. The delicious irony of a person like Matt Gaetz serving as Attorney General is a lost opportunity to satirists for generations to come. And similarly, I was glad to see that Hegseth was confirmed, even though it took the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Vance to get him in as Defense Secretary. Because in some ways, I think the opportunity to do as much damage to the country as quickly as possible by these horrible, horrible appointments it gives me some hope that, as I was saying earlier, the light will dawn in the midterm elections. Although I have to say, I did not look into the races that are coming up in the Senate and the House as you have, David. So I'm chastened by your caution that the tides may not change in the midterm as much as I'm hoping they would. But the opportunity, if it's not long-term, the opportunity to do damage, if it's not long-term damage, is perversely appealing to me, with the exception of judicial appointments, because we're already seeing the generational impact of Supreme Court appointments from the first Trump term and the number of federal judges and federal appellate judges who will be appointed in the next few years gives me grave concern. That battle is largely lost because the Senate is not going to exercise any independent judgment, I don't believe. But executive branch appointments, there's a part of me that wants to see the worst of the worst nominated and confirmed as quickly as possible, so they have as much opportunity to do as much damage as possible for people to really see clearly the results of a Trump, quote, mandate.
Well, all I'll say to that is there will be plenty for satirists to deal with, even without the nominations that you recommended. Okay, Reva.
Well, remember, you're wishing, be careful what you wish for, because when you wish for that, then the whole country suffers. But what I thought was interesting is that AOC, an outspoken progressive for the Democratic Party, did a survey of her district because there were people that voted for Trump and voted for her. And there were people also that were for Bernie Sanders that voted for Trump. So what did those 3 people have in common? Well, supposedly it was authenticity and being in straight talk that they had in common, that they had a certain disruptor vibe to them. Obviously, we would approve of AOC and Bernie Sanders. And Kamala Harris always said that she was the underdog. To say that they didn't do as well as they expected, it was always a close race. The polls were always close. And then she had the disadvantage of being a woman and a woman of color.
One other thing, quoting James Carvell, it's the economy. It was that
Stupid.
$12 hamburger that went to $19, stayed at $19, and people never forgave Biden or Harris that. I can almost guarantee you within the next 4 years, there's going to be a recession of some sort, and they'll blame it on Trump. So, people are fickle in that way, and, we're going to have to suffer a little bit, but, like I said, that what we're paying now and inflation is stabilized, but it's still at that high level. And that's why Biden lost. And market can't go on forever. So that's just my comment.
Inflation is at a very low level, but prices are still at a high level.
Right, that $12 hamburger is still $19 that I go out for. And some places down here in Florida, they're at like $25. So, it's pretty, it's expensive eating out lately.
Okay. Anyone want the last word? Mort. You're muted again, Mort.
We're living in a bubble.
I said that.
Yeah. And I think the kind of policies he's doing at the border are receiving much more approval around the country than they are disapproval.
That's what the polls indicate so far.
Yeah. And wanting these terrible people to take office is not a solution. They have to be, kept from taking office because they will do. And I can't think of a worse position to have access than being next to the president with a possible ability to start a nuclear war. So it's not looking good, not looking good.
Well, on that note, we've come to 9 o'clock. And I just end up in the same way that I started. We do have good news. We have 7 hostages that have been released. So our next session is sometime in late April. I don't remember the exact date, 28th of April. And that'll be the final one for this academic year. So thank you all.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I usually don't go for quite so long. I usually stop about 8:20 or somewhere around in there. Yeah, I thought we had a very good discussion.